If you rehear, something in you is already shifting, a quiet question stirring beneath your thoughts about power, fairness, and the idea of the people deciding what's best. Socrates, that ancient figure who questioned everything, had a complicated, almost restless relationship with democracy. He didn't merely dislike democracy as a political system. He was wary of its promises, its faults, and its vulnerabilities. And that suspicion still echoes, hidden in the foundations of how we govern ourselves today. Let us explore why Socrates might have hated democracy, but more importantly, what that reveals about the fragility of popular power and the shadow side of collective decision-making. SFX, soft___ chimes. To first consider this, democracy, in its original form in Athens, was not a global ideal. It was a radical experiment. Ordinary citizens gathered to decide laws, policies, and even the fate of individuals. The powerful word was given to the many. This was promising and terrifying. For Socrates, who valued knowledge and expertise, the mass decision could easily become the tyranny of ignorance. But what does that mean? Isn't democracy about equality, the collective wisdom of the many rather than the few? Yet here lies the irony. Socrates wasn't against the people ruling themselves because he despised the people. No. He distrusted the idea that majority opinion could always be wise or just. SFX, distant_crowd_murmur. 3. Have you ever noticed how a group, caught in the heat of emotion or impatience, might rush into decisions that later seem reckless? Socrates saw democracy vulnerable to exactly this. The sway of passion over reason, popularity over truth. If we accept that the majority can sometimes be blind, what then? What if the loudest voice isn't the wisest? What if the people can be manipulated, swayed by rhetoric or promise, rather than grasping what is genuinely good? Reflect on this paradox. Democracy's strength is also its weakness. It values freedom so much that it risks chaos. Freedom to speak, to vote, even to decide who leads. But without a foundation of wisdom, can freedom alone hold a society steady? Socrates invited us to question this. He challenged the assumption that all opinions hold equal weight in matters of justice or governance. He asked, how do we know who is truly knowledgeable? Who is qualified to decide what's right for the whole? And most pointedly, how do we prevent the unwise from leading us to ruin? SFX, echo_softly, whoosh 1. 5. What if, Socrates hinted, the real problem isn't democracy itself, but how we engage with it? Imagine a society where people don't just vote, but think deeply, where individuals train themselves to discern, reflect, and question. In that vision, democracy could approach something like wisdom, but if it becomes mere majority rule, led by persuasion rather than understanding, it risks collapse. Now this isn't just ancient history or abstract philosophy. Tell me, what have you been swept up in a decision? Feeling the collective momentum like a wave carrying you without steering your own direction? Have you witnessed or felt how easily truth can be distorted when everyone claims to speak for the people? Socrates was famously sentenced to death by the very democratic system he critiqued. Was this the final, tragic irony? That a man who asked uncomfortable questions was silenced by the many he wished to awaken? It's a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities within democracy, how it can consume what it fears, or reject what it doesn't understand. Let me ask you, what if the antidote to democracy as failings isn't less voice, but more self-awareness? What if each citizen must become a philosopher in their own right, practicing the simple art of questioning themselves as much as questioning others? Socrates suggests a form of democracy that doesn't just count votes, but cultivates wisdom, a collective consciousness that doesn't succumb to slogans or fleeting trends, but listens deeply for what sustains justice and community over time. SFX, heart_beat_soft. 2. If that's true, then perhaps Socrates hated democracy not because he detested people's power, but because he feared it without mindfulness was a seed that could grow into chaos or tyranny. Not because he mistrusted the many, but because he knew how easily the many could be misled by charisma, ignorance, fear. What if the question isn't, does democracy work? But how do we, as individuals and as a collective, become worthy of it? This isn't a lament, but an invitation to lean into discomfort, to ask ourselves when we are truly listening and when we are simply echoing the crowd, to notice when our judgments are driven by fear or by curiosity. SFX, soft_rain. 3. So, don't rush to judge democracy yet. Notice instead your own participation in it, your doubts, your hopes, your fears. The very fact you're pondering this means you're already part of what Socrates would call the examined democracy, the living question rather than the settled answer. Remember, wisdom begins not with answers forced upon us, but with questions invited from within, questions that unsettle, that challenge, that open new paths. What if the ultimate lesson Socrates offers isn't a hatred of democracy, but love for its potential to be better, deeper, more aware? How do you carry that responsibility inside yourself? SFX, wind_gently_blowing. 2. If you're feeling lost in the noise, uncertain if the masses will lead to justice or ruin, know that this tension is the beginning of awakening a sacred place where philosophy meets life. Socrates stands not as a judge, but as a companion on this path of questioning. If you're here listening, you're already part of the living dialogue that democracy needs most, the conversation with ourselves. So ask, in what ways am I a citizen who doesn't just vote but thinks? Who doesn't just follow but seeks? Who doesn't just belong but understands? SFX, soft_chime. 1. 5. These questions don't resolve overnight. They ripple, persist, transform, and they invite us, gently, to become the democracy we wish to live within, a democracy not of the many voices, but of many wise silences and many courageous truths. What will you do with that invitation? What questions will you dare to ask next? Thinking more about Socrates' critique, let us remember that his education was rooted deeply in the belief that virtue and knowledge are inseparable. For him, to govern wisely meant to govern with inside a mind refined by questioning, not a crowd swept by impulse. But democracy, by its nature, invites every voice to participate equally. This sounds beautiful until you realize that not all voices carry equal understanding. When someone untrained in the art of judgment navigates crucial decisions, what happens? What if the loudest opinions drown out the subtle, harder truths? Look around at today's world, and this tension relentlessly plays out. Misinformation spreads quickly. Tribal loyalties organize votes. People demand change, sometimes more swiftly than thoughtfulness allows. Socrates saw the beginning of this when he lived, warning us to beware of the seductive power of opinion unmoored from reason. SFX, clock_50_slow. 3. Now, think of democracy not as a static system, but as a living organism, a garden requiring constant tending. Socrates feared that without careful cultivation, this garden can become overrun with weeds, demagoguery, populism, factionalism. How does a society defend itself from those who use charm and emotion to manipulate rather than inspire true wisdom? Socrates himself was tagged a danger by his fellow citizens, labeled a corrupter of youth, because he questioned the comfortable stories everyone accepted. This leads us to the heart of his worry. Democracy can easily slip from freedom in a license where any belief, no matter how uninformed, gains equal legitimacy simply because it's popular. Have you noticed how in moments of social upheaval, reason can fall prey to the momentum of collective fear or anger? What if the very foundation of democratic choice depends not just on the act of voting, but on cultivating an inner life of discernment? What if the tragedy Socrates foresaw wasn't democracy per se, but the absence of inner discipline among its citizens? SFX, page_turn, 1. 5. What if his whole quarrel with democracy is, in fact, a challenge to us? Not to settle for comfortable consensus, but to seek the uncomfortable questioning that grows maturity? After all, the Socratic method itself demands uncertainty, admitting what we don't know so that real knowledge might emerge. You might find this unsettling, especially in a world that prizes certainty and clarity. Yet, Socrates reminds us that wisdom begins with doubt, with a readiness to confront one's limitations. And this is what democracy requires if it is to survive its own excesses: a collective humility, a willingness to be wrong, a commitment to ongoing inquiry. Now, consider how this insight matters personally. When you face decisions, political or otherwise, do you notice your own tendency to favor quick judgments or consensual ease? When do you pause to ask, how much of my opinion is informed by genuine reflection? How much by social pressure or emotional bias? Socrates shows that the path to better democracy might start within each of us, by practicing the simple but radical act of self-examination. SFX, water_drip, 2 inches fact, his trial and death were his ultimate demonstration. Sentenced by a democratic vote, Socrates chose to accept the law's judgment rather than flee, standing as an embodiment of integrity within flawed democracy. What does this teach us? That democracy, imperfect as it is, still binds us all in mutual responsibility. It also reveals a delicate balance. If democracy punishes its own truth seekers, it risks undermining its foundations. And if it fails to cultivate a culture of questioning, it sows the seeds of its own decay. So, if you feel disillusioned or uncertain about the promises of democracy or afraid of its failures, know that such doubt is part of an ancient but living dialogue. The question isn't about condemning democracy, but about growing it up. How do you participate in this growth? By refusing to settle for the noise, by cultivating patience for difficult conversations, by listening deeply to perspectives that unsettle your own. SFX, wind_leaves, 3. Remember, Socrates never claimed to offer answers. He offered questions. Questions that invite us to interrogate not just political systems, but ourselves, our assumptions, our biases, our readiness to engage honestly. In embracing this, democracy transforms from a mere mechanic of voting to a practiced art of collective wisdom. Imagine a democracy where each citizen is a philosopher, cultivating reflection as much as opinion. A space where truth isn't trumped by popularity, but nourished by dialogue. This remains the ultimate lesson from Socrates' uneasy dance with democracy: that freedom without wisdom is a fragile gift, and that the true challenge lies in our commitment to face the uncomfortable task of knowing ourselves better. SFX, soft_bell, 1. 5. So, I invite you, in whatever moment you find yourself now, to sit with this question: how am I caring for my capacity to discern? How am I holding space for both conviction and curiosity? And how might that inner work ripple out into the collective whole? The promise of democracy is not guaranteed by institutions alone. It blooms only when individuals commit to the hard, often lonely, work of inquiry when we become, in Socrates' words, lovers of wisdom rather than lovers of opinion. This is not rejection, but a deep invitation. An invitation that remains urgent, timeless, and profoundly alive. What will you choose to explore next in your own mind and heart? SFX, deep_exhale, 2. Because if you're asking these questions right now, you are part of the legacy Socrates hoped for: citizens not content with easy answers, but willing to carry the torch of reflection forward. And in that light, democracy might be not an end, but a beginning.